Check Podcasts.
Welcome to the Rising Economy podcast, where leading thinkers, changemakers, and newsmakers discuss current issues and bold ideas impacting the economy and people of Greater Victoria.
Welcome to the Rising Economy podcast, brought to you by South Island Prosperity Partnership, Greater Victoria's regional economic development agency and host of the annual Rising Economy Conference. I'm Kerry Slavens, your host for today's Rising Economy episode. Today, we are talking about leading together, making collaboration work for the South Island. We're podcasting today from Czech Studios, located on the unceded territories of the Lekwungen people, known today as the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. Well, today we're going to talk about a pretty important event that took place in Victoria last week that brought 100 local leaders together to talk about some key issues and economic constraints affecting the future of Southern Vancouver Island. Hosted by South Island Prosperity Partnership, Local Leadership Day 2023 drew many mayors, city councillors, municipal staff, and key business and community stakeholders from throughout the region. The aim of the event was to explore, collaborate interjurisdictionally, and lay the groundwork for the future. To talk about Local Leadership Day's emerging insights and impact, I'm happy to welcome today two of the event's key organizers. First, Steve Duck. Hi, Steve. Is a councillor from the township of Sidney and a member of the Municipal Partners Committee for South Island Prosperity Partnership. Dallas Gislason is Executive Director of Community Economies for South Island Prosperity Partnership. A major part of Dallas's role is working in collaboration with municipalities across the region to create resilient, innovative, sustainable, and equitable, or a RISE, future for Greater Victoria and the South Island. Well, gentlemen, many people would say it's no small feat to get such a large turnout, and it's no small feat to get so many mayors, councillors, and stakeholders together from throughout the region to actually talk about collaboration. For those of you who don't know, we are a region of 400,000 plus people, 13 municipalities, that means 13 mayors, dozens and dozens of councillors, hundreds of thousands constituents who all have their own needs and wants. And it was up to Steve and Dallas and the committees they work with to try and get people to come together this weekend from all of those regions. Dallas, I want to hear more about Local Leadership Day, but first, how the heck did you manage to get so many representatives from so many municipalities into one room and focused on collaborating?
That's a good question. It was very difficult. No, no. Not to make light of it. I mean, collaboration is hard. It's easier to go alone in whatever you're doing, right? Because you have a locus of control. But in this case, if we sort of think about Greater Victoria or the South Island as a regional economy, as defined by where people's household prosperity is generated, so where their income occurs, where their job opportunities, where their career ladder, where their children or grandchildren can make career opportunities for themselves. If we think about that as a regional economy, then it sort of makes sense to look at how that economy is working for us, and where it's not working for us, it makes sense to sort of come together and figure out all the respective roles that whether they're local governments or institutions like UVic or Camosun or et cetera, and we all have sort of a part to play in solving whatever issues that are holding us back from achieving our potential. So that's really the sort of the foundational thesis, if you will, of why collaboration happens. And we're lucky in a region, like we sort of like to joke that we have 13 mayors and all these councillors. But the flip side of that is we have a lot of passionate people who want to, they care about the places that they live. They run for office, and Steve can tell you that it's not a high-paying gig. It's a lot of work. It's not just the campaigning side, the door knocking and all that, but also once you get elected, you really do have to engage in a lot of different topic areas. Sometimes it can get quite detail-oriented and all that kind of stuff. So our job is to really present a platform to these folks and say, hey, let's explore these issues together, and you can take away areas that you're responsible for, but there's also interjurisdictional stuff. There's stuff that the nonprofits can do. There's stuff where the private sector can do. And let's just get in the room and have that conversation and figure out what the next steps are.
Great. And Steve, I mean, as a counselor in
Yep.
Sidney, I mean, I imagine it's a fairly rare occurrence that you're able to get so many people from across the region together.
Absolutely. And I just want to emphasize that it is a rare opportunity where we get to meet with our colleagues from the other municipalities and other jurisdictions. The uniqueness of this, and kudos to the South Island Prosperity Partnership, is that typically when we get in a room together, it's related to the Capital Regional District and operational infrastructure stuff. So to come into a opportunity like this for a day-long conversation on really relevant topics and have an opportunity to explore them, not to just kind of think, okay, because 95% of the job of a councillor is looking after the local infrastructure. So there's very little time that we can spend on sort of bigger things and bigger explosion and looking at just exploring other ideas and other solutions. So again, kudos to the partnership, because it brings us together to actually do that. We don't get that opportunity. So you're asking how we got that many people in the room, because we don't get to do it. So it's like, okay, let's jump at this opportunity and see what we can do with it.
That's great. And I guess, Dallas, why you've answered a bit of this, but why did South Island Prosperity Partnership decide to make a day of local leadership?
Yeah, I think it goes back a few years. We started this process sort of coming out of the pandemic, and the pandemic was obviously it was a health crisis first and foremost, but it also had this economic fallout, right? Where we have a lot of businesses that rely on tourism and visitors, and we have all these sectors of the economy that were being shut down and restricted, and there was all this economic issue that came out with it. And so when SIPP sort of took this facilitation role through the pandemic of managing the economy, what we sort of discovered, or reinforced, I guess, if you will, is that there's all these different aspects of the economy. We think of the economy as businesses, but the economy is actually more about human behavior than anything, right? It's where we live, work, and spend money and support our households and all this kind of stuff. And so the economy writ large was really an opportunity for us to have that regional conversation. And in that, you look at all these different roles and responsibilities of coming out of a situation like a pandemic. And it was sort of this realization that, the local governments really, they're the foundation of SIPP. So the municipal governments are the entities that created SIPP in the first place back in 2016. And so Local Leadership Day was really the emergence of like, okay, let's focus on their aspects and their priorities and their sort of vertical areas within this broader context of a regional economy. And then we can actually start to look at the policy levers, like the stuff that they can manipulate and control, and stuff that they can either do as jurisdictions, but also then with each other as collaborative interjurisdictional opportunities. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. And Steve, you're part of the Municipal Partners Committee, which comprises elected representatives of the 10 municipalities who are SIPP members. I want to mention that we did have representatives there from just about all of the municipalities. Your committee played a major role in deciding the focus of Local Leadership Day. Can you tell us what the 3 big issues were you decided to focus on?
It was interesting how we got to those. I think that's an important step too, because you're trying to look at what the different leadership groups municipalities and other leaders in the community can have a part in creating actions for. So initially we had a list of about 15 things where we saw that across the region that there could be impact from different jurisdictions. And I was saying, okay, well, you can't address 15 in a day, so what's realistic? And so we went out to the municipal partners and said, okay, here's that list of 15. What do you think is what resonates with you, is to sort of say, here's something we can work on. And the intent wasn't to find a topic that everybody could work on, but to find topics that there could be shared relationships, collaborations, partnerships to work on solutions and actions. And the important, I want to emphasize actions, because it was not just like, hey, we're getting together for a day and kind of having a chit chat and out we go. Is we want to see progress. And the idea of that is that we start looking at those actions and those activities over a period of time and see what we can do to impact them. And so what came back from the partnership when we asked them was 3 relevant topics. One was economic vibrancy. The second was climate and emergency responsiveness and resiliency. And the last was maintaining and attracting an essential workforce. And those three were what we felt that through the partnership group that we could, as a region, have some impact on individually as a local municipal government, and along with the leaders, as you mentioned, from other businesses, and that we could have some impact on, and that we're not going to end tomorrow. We all know there's not a quick silver bullet that's going to resolve any of those, that we'll be working at them with the intent of saying, okay, next time we meet, how are we doing? Where are we going? What came out of that meeting? So those three were the primary targets.
Were these also issues that perhaps, I mean, housing is major, and many people say, well, why weren't you talking about housing? But Dallas or Steve, do you want to address that? Why these topics?
Well, and certainly housing was high on the list, but we looked at it and say, okay, that is a big nut to crack.
It sure is.
And so how we narrowed that down is that, okay, what do we need housing essentially for? Well, those essential workers is where we need them primarily. And that's throughout, it's from the lowest paying job to the highest paying job. Those are all essential workers. And then we further narrowed that and say, okay, healthcare, because you need to take off a bite that you can chew on and actually work with. If we looked at housing across the region, we'd be like, okay, you could spend a week, 2 weeks, 10 months. I mean, look at what's happening in terms of that process right now. It's not something you can sort of say, look at in a day and kind of say, okay, what actions can we take and go on that? So that was important, was to identify were actionable focuses to work on, not things that were global issues, world hunger, housing, that were just too big to bite.
Right. Okay. Dallas, do you want to add to that?
I was just going to say that the conversation that they had at the organizing committee was also around topics that municipalities deal with day in and day out, and housing was certainly one of those. And we said, okay, well, what value can SIPP as a regional entity, what value can we add to that conversation? And the same with transportation, right? We did talk about transportation as being an economic issue that needs to be improved around the region. And the CRD is already taking on a big part of that through exploring a regional commission and things like this. So we said, okay, well, let's just park those, and knowing that municipalities are already working week in and week out on both of those issues every single week.
Right. Okay. I mean, very good point. And so you got all these people, 100 people together in a room, community leaders. Now, how did you work and organize the day to make these conversations, not just make sure people were talking, but that people were listening and engaging meaningfully and coming up with actions?
Yeah, I think some of the feedback we got, so we did this last year, last November too, so November 2022, I guess it would have been, which was actually right after the election. So there was an election about a year and a bit ago. And we had this local leadership event where we had some good topics, discussions. We talked about the Indigenous economy back then. We talked about place economies and sort of the sort of field of the public realm and improving. So we had some good topics, and the feedback we heard was, because that was right after the election, it was a good chance to just sort of like dip your toe in on some of these issues and just sort of hear from thought leaders. We had Mary Rowe, who's fabulous, from the Canadian Urbanism Institute, for example, and we had Caroline Hilton, talking about Indigenous stuff. So it was a good chance to sort of like hey, we're starting a new term in office. We want to talk about economic development. What does that mean? What are some of the topics? And so the feedback we got was, for next year, let's sort of go deeper and get toward the action, as Steve alluded, right? And so this year we designed it. We actually engaged a facilitator to help us sort of design a way to deep dive, and in a way that would be engaging, but also move us from the idea of like, okay, let's educate ourselves a bit on the topic, but then let's move into thinking about the future state, talking about the constraints, what's holding us back, and then going into what potential solutions and actions and next steps might be. So that's sort of how we designed the event. We had 3 topics. We had 3 panels to sort of like give us a broad brush strokes and a little bit of maybe some sparking of ideas on like, here's what could happen. And then we moved into the table discussions. So every table in the room had a facilitator to sort of walk through some guided questions that were all thought of in advance. And then we had a note taker sort of documenting the whole thing, and from there we'll take it and sort of analyze the stuff that came out. And as Steve also said, is that we don't want this to be just a place where we came to learn and talk, nor do we want this to be a place where we came to learn and talk and produce a report, right? We want to take that report and actually carve out the next steps from it. So
Okay, very interesting. And I think what people may not realize, a lot of what you do at South Island Prosperity is really listening. In order to come up with the future, it's not just telling everybody what to do, obviously. You spend a lot of time listening, don't you?
yeah, economic development is a team sport for sure. Very, very, very much about consulting, engaging the community, both from the public, but also the stakeholders, right? Private sector, the employers, the training institutions, right? All these players that have a role in the economy. And our job is to really put our finger on the pulse as best we can. And the only way to do that is through listening and learning what's going on the ground.
That's really great.
I'd just add to that because I think it's important that as the committee got together, we wanted to make sure that there wasn't that one-hit wonder, that you're coming away with next steps and direction with that. Not solutions, but to start thinking about the solutions. And those solutions are in the room. There are people from around this community that can share that information. So that was number one, was sharing. Second was, okay, the next step is the collaboration on those actions to bring them forward. And that engagement, I think Dal said it earlier, that engagement was important because it gets people involved in the solution. There's not somebody up there going like, oh, you just do this, and do this. It's like, okay, how do we do that? Where do we do it? What are the things what are the challenges to that? And it was making sure that we get those things moving forward. And that's the intent. It isn't just, as Dallas said, not just hey, it was a great thing. Here's the report. See you later.
For sure.
It's like next time when we meet, which will be at probably Rise Victoria, will be here's what we've done so far. Here's the information that came out of that meeting. What's the next step?
Okay, that's awesome. I want to just for our listeners, I want to just break down these topics a little bit more. I don't know if it's fair to ask you if there's any early observations or insights, but let's just talk about the topics themselves and why they are key issues for the region. The first one was vibrant places, local economic development approaches in a regional context. So that one seems fairly obvious to me, but maybe I know you're going to have more to say on that, both of you.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, historically, Dallas and I have been collaborating on economic development since way back, and he was with the Chamber of Commerce in Sidney.
2011, I guess.
Yeah,
it would be.
2011.
Yeah, a while ago.
It's an interesting because that's the process you have to think about in economic development. It's not a switch you click over. It's a process, and again, that engagement, that involvement, and looking at it. And for the region, it's about what we want to get people thinking about is that collaboration across the region, that shared response. We have it in some of our infrastructure, whether that's police or fire or water or recreation. Those exist, but how can we get into the other aspects of a community, which is its economic development, so that when you look at something like Ocean or IPC, which are developments by SIPP, they will be part of how do we bring the region together to work together on those. Not that they're going to be these little fiefdoms over here that create those solutions, that we're working together for the betterment of the region. And we each have our strengths. And that's what we want to work on the strengths. And somebody's going to come up with some ideas over here that can be supported by some service over here. And that's what we want to start seeing.
Well, and it is amazing watching. I mean, you referred to Coast, and IPC is the Indigenous Prosperity Center. And, seeing how many aspects of these move out regionally, from Souk, if we're looking at ocean marine stewardship, to Sidney with the kelp, Saanich Peninsula, the technologies emerging in Victoria and everywhere. So, it is lovely to see this regional kind of thinking. Dallas?
Yeah, I was just going to say there's the sort of two sides of this. One is the household prosperity, which was like, how do you collaborate across the region to create prosperity, future career opportunities, embracing your strengths around things like ocean marine, Indigenous economy, and many other sectors across the region. Then there's this other side of it, which is really the locality, the local places. And so you think about Sidney, to use Sidney has this vibrant, walkable, or downtown or central business district, we sometimes call them, that creates this. It's sort of like this asset that feeds. I call it this tapestry. It's like you weave all these little places together around the region. You have Brentwood Bay and Saanich, and I live in Cadboro Bay, which is where the Gyro Park and UVic is right near there. So you think of all these little places that make up this tapestry that we call the region. And that's the other side of this too, is that you have all these issues that are I mean, the pandemic created one of them, which was the shift to remote work, right? So it
Yes.
creates a different dynamic for how people use their neighborhoods, and ideally we want to have more walkable neighborhoods that are amenity rich and all these things. The other part of this too is thinking about some of the things that are coming down at us from the local place aspect, and one of them that's quite big actually is the need for succession. So what's happening in Canada is we have a very top-heavy demographic structure,
Yes.
and a lot of our businesses all across Canada, not just here, but we are a slightly older demographic than some other cities in Canada. But we have this sort of slow-moving train coming at us, where a lot of these places that are dominated by local businesses, mom and pops, and other, some of them are chains and things like this. And we actually need to think about that as like, how do we actually ensure that the next generation of business owners, business people, are coming in and are keeping those places vibrant, because it really, a lot of it is, it's these local businesses that really make up that fabric. If you walk down Beacon Avenue in Sidney, a lot of these businesses are locally owned, and it's local people. It's sort of like where everybody knows your name sord of
It is
concept,
kind of like
right?
that in Sydney.
Yeah.
But I think that extends to across the region, because
It
you can do the same in Sandishton, you can do the same in Cadborough Bay, you can do that in Oak Bay, you can do that down in Cook Street Village. So those local areas are very essential to the economic vibrance of the area. And that's the shared solution, is that, hey, that worked over here, maybe it'll work over here.
Right.
And that we all work together. You don't know when you're crossing from Saanich into Central Saanich, or from Victoria into Saanich. Those are just artificial boundaries that are put in place for infrastructure management, not for the vibrancy of our region.
Very good point. And Dallas, a couple of years ago, I believe you worked with Esri to come up with a map that showed how people really do live and work, and their movements across the region, our regional economy. Can you just quickly talk about that?
Yeah, we have this in economic development. We have this. It's sort of like 4 criteria for what is a regional economy. Like, what's that container that you would operate in? The first of those 4 is a commuter shed. So that's what the map was. So what we did is we took a sample of, I think it was 19 sort of larger employers around the region, and we mapped the first 3 digits of their employees' postal codes, where they live, and sort of mapped that visually. And you could see, like, an employer would be here on the map, and then you'd have all these lines going up all over. And it was a true representation, even with a small sample size of 19, where you had people all over the region commuting. So the commuter shed is the first criteria, but there's also the second one is more around human behavior. So it's sort of like you think about your life, your mind's eye, like, what's my life? Where do I go? Where do I get my coffee? Where do I get my groceries? Where do I take the kids to daycare? Where do I walk my dog? Where do I go kayaking? All that stuff that makes up your natural sort of playground, and where you consume services as well. And then the third one is it's sort of like the B2B, the trade pattern of the businesses. So the interconnectivity of these main streets and the places, supply chains and things like that. And then the third one is this, it's we call it the natural boundaries, but it's things like rivers and mountains and water. We're surrounded by water.
Right.
So it creates this natural container. And so ours is really like this metropolitan container of where you could live and work and play, and literally in all these different jurisdictions. So then it makes sense to sort of, bring that region together and talk about the future, even though there is the local jurisdictional areas that SIPP doesn't play in around land use and things like this. But
I love that, because I estimate I'm probably every day in an average of 5 municipalities.
Yeah, daily.
I mean, and I love it. I love it. So let's talk about the next one, which is quite interesting. I mean, we're in a major earthquake zone. Climate change is imposing its own threats upon us. And there's also the new Emergency Act from the province that is going to be impacting everything. So climate and emergency resilience and response was the second topic. Opportunities for proactive regional collaboration. Who wants to start on that? What's
Well,
it's a hard topic.
I think it's an interesting one, because it's climate and emergency. Certainly, we're all aware. Hey, we live in an earthquake zone, and so the big one can come, and there could be a tsunami and that sort of thing. So yes, that's a dramatic emergency response. But there's also, you have to look at, if there's a breakdown in transportation. We have 48 hours of food on Southern Vancouver Island. What does that mean? If we had forest fire like they did in the interior, what does that mean if that was closing down the way north, or swept down into John Dean Park? And so I think there are a number of emergencies. The wildfires of the past season and the climate emergencies and the heat domes have alerted us to the fact that, hey, we shouldn't be just thinking about the big one. We should be thinking of all aspects of that, and climate comes into that because it impacts that. And that concept is needs to be shared across the region, because I think you're starting to see that with a number of the fire departments anyways, where they have shared response. And if there's a fire in View Royal, there's a response from Esquimalt, there's a response from Saanich, there's a response from Colwood. And that's the kind of thing we need to think about on a bigger scale, because we'll probably have to do that. You looked at most of our fire departments providing staff and services to the interior to help them. So I think that there's been a little more awakening of just what we have to do in terms of climate and emergency response and resiliency.
It was very, very interesting. I don't want to talk too much about the table I was at Local Leadership Day, but one of the things we talked about is, of course, the blizzard of '96 came out.
Of course.
And everybody listened to CFAX radio.
Yeah.
And so the joke was that, we've got to teach Gen Y and Z about AM radio because nothing else is going to work, Anyway, Dallas, can you talk about this topic, climate and emergency resilience and response?
Yeah, one thing that I think, just for contextually for people to be aware of, is that the government of British Columbia just tabled legislation on this that will require local governments to create these emergency management plans. I can't remember the exact terminologies, but it's basically new rules and regulations that has all these roles and responsibilities outlined across 4 different phases. And so with the organizing committee, we really, or they talked about, like, okay, so how do you tackle this big topic of climate change, and how do we actually come up with actions to collaborate on? And where they landed was with this new legislation is there's this need to think about business continuity and recovery, right? And so if you think about business continuity, it's this idea like, okay, well, we actually don't have enough food to last our region very long. Like if we get cut off, if there's an issue with one of our ports and things like this. And so that's sort of a continuity thing. Like we need food on shelves, or consumer goods, if you will, to think of it broader. And those all come in because we are an island. They come in through ports and infrastructure, right? And so we were lucky to have a gentleman on the panel that day from Seaspan Ferries, which supplies a lot of our consumer goods around the region. So that's the continuity side. And then the recovery side is really thinking about this. So you have this big, almost not unlike the pandemic, right? It created this fallout where you have this external force that's forcing you to change and adapt and do something. And climate change is a thing like that. It's this external thing that we are, we're trying to control it or play our small role in doing that. But it's this external force that's forcing itself on us, and it's gonna cause us to have to change things, right? So that's both. There's a proactive sort of thinking ahead, like how do we ensure that we're as resilient as we can, but then also if something does happen, how do we ensure that we can get operating and back up to
exactly
because people rely on the economy for their prosperity too.
It's interesting you say it, because that continuity piece, I think, you have to look at the pandemic and thank COVID for coming along, because it was not something we enjoyed, but it did give us that alertness and that awakening to say, oh, let's think about this a bit more. All the
especially if you were out of toilet paper.
Yeah, I was just going to say that there's no toilet paper. What do we do? And so that business continuity is like, how do people go to work? And I think one of the advantages that came out of COVID, it really helped people understand and that relationship between businesses and their employees, that they need to work at home. And that works pretty good. And so there was a change in mindsets with businesses as to how they work, so that if there's a bigger dilemma and a longer recovery period, then we can do this.
Yeah.
We've practiced this.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And, Kevin Rockosh was the general manager of Seaspan Ferries. He was the one on the panel. And one thing that, really opened my eyes was when he talked about just how, organized and precise the supply chain system is. And that, we somehow think suppliers, maybe they're sitting around with 4 or 5 days surplus, and they're actually not, because they can't.
Yeah.
So we talked about this we learned about this in business school years ago, but so Walmart was one of the innovators of, it's called the GIT inventory system, which stands for just in time, right? Which means I take this book off the shelf, which triggers using a barcode, it triggers something in Walmart's system that says, oh, there's a book that came off the shelf, and it triggers an order for another book. Just one book though. Not a package of 10 books, right? So it's just in time. And so that's how that's the sort of like what Walmart innovated back in the 90s is now what our entire supply chain is utilizing. And it's based on this idea of just sort of like a continuous churn. But what happened with the pandemic, as we saw, is people sort of start panicking. People are not rational, right? They go to the store and they're like, oh, I got to buy all this stuff because there's an earthquake. I got to buy all the canned goods in the store. And then someone comes in behind and the shelves are empty, right? So,
well, as we also learned from that panel, is that it's just not about climate and COVID. In this case, it was the wildfires in the interior that were stopping the supply lines and the trucks coming through that way. So all of a sudden, they were waiting in the port of Vancouver to be able to take delivery of those things to ship them out throughout the province, and they weren't coming in.
Oh my goodness. Well, even if there's a big accident on the Malahat, anything coming from up island.
right.
And I mean, there often is something blocking the Malahat. It is better. It is better. than
Including
it used.
workers.
Yeah.
Yeah, and our main port, just for those listening, is in Duke Point, which is on the other side of the Malahat. So,
So it's a ways to go. Last, of course, but not least, we're all thinking any employer, anybody trying to get anything done in this region is thinking about essential workers. How do we attract and welcome them here? And particularly for the purposes of Local Leadership Day, healthcare, because that is so critical to us. So who wants to start with that topic?
Yeah, well, I guess the two parts of that. So the organizing committee did talk about essential workers, and we could talk about trades workers and like the need for construction and there's all these areas across the economy. The hotel workers, they talk about this all the time, where they can't get enough work. The agriculture sector, and so we had to sort of hone in on that, and we said, okay, well, really, if you think about the sentiment of economic development. There is a sort of an idea of like our region is vibrant because it's growing, right? It's not stagnant. People do want to move here and live here, but the more that we see shortages in healthcare, like where you have like ER closures or shortened hours, or nobody can get a family doctor, or like the wait times for surgeries, all these issues compile, and then we say, you know what? Maybe we should actually look at not growing anymore. And sort of pulling up the drawbridge and saying like, okay, until we all have a doctor, like nobody else can come, right? And that's a sentiment that does exist. And so from an economic development perspective, it's like, no, we actually need to think about healthcare and access to healthcare as an essential building block or foundational block of a healthy, vibrant economy.
Yeah.
And so that's where the organizing committee, decided to let's talk about healthcare and access and what can we do. I mean, yeah, it's a provincial mandate, but there are things that we can do proactively in the region to really.
And I think that's the important part is that there is, and we spoke about it earlier about housing challenges throughout. But if you can't get a doctor, then your ER is closed, or you don't have an aid worker that can come in and take care of your elderly parents. These are all pieces of the community fabric that allow us to continue. It comes back to economic vibrance and that business continuity. Those all impact that. If you can't get those services, it changes the ability to complete your services as an employee or employer.
Right. And I mean, Dallas, we've had many conversations about GDP is not the only, nor is it always the best measure of an economy. We've talked about the well-being economy with health and well-being as a determinant.
The best way to think about economic development, honestly, is improvement. What we want, and it's not about growth. It's about let's look at year after year after year, and we all have this idea like we want our kids to be better off than we were, right?
Yep.
And our parents were like that too. And so that's, to me, is about improvement. How do we improve the quality of life, the standard of living over time? And then you have these external forces that are threatening that from happening, right? And so healthcare is just one of those things. It's like you absolutely, when you don't have it and you're healthy, you don't really notice, but as soon as you need it, it is like the thing. It's the thing that defines your quality of life if it doesn't exist.
That's a really good point. Well, both of you, what have you learned from Local Leadership Day in terms of what is the potential and the vision for Local Leadership Day going forward? And how do events like this contribute to the overall growth and prosperity of the region?
I would say first off that we have to again acknowledge the South Island Prosperity Partnership for doing this, because again, if it only happens in the infrastructure delivery end of it, which is the primary mandate of the Capital Regional District operations, there's nobody getting together and thinking about the future, looking down the line. And I think that's the important part the SIP brings to us, to bring those leaders together for that opportunity. So I think this is just the beginning of a fantastic journey that is going to get more and more collaboration, shared thinking, shared services, shared outcomes. That is because of SIP that we're actually doing that. That wasn't happening before. So we now have 13 municipalities. We have I think 9 or 10
Nine First Nations.
Yep.
All thinking together, getting together and thinking,
Mm-hmm.
and working towards actions and solutions. And I think that's the important part. We're in this together. We're collaborating together. We're sharing together.
And I'll just build on that. Like the unfortunately, often what happens when you're an elected official is you get forced to look at sort of the negatives, right? People say like, "Oh, fix my pothole, fix this. This is broken," and they want to sort of air their grievances at the council meeting or a public hearing or whatever it is. And so, and that's there's a place for that. And I know we talked a lot today about constraints and these issues that we need to solve and all this kind of stuff. But part of that, and Steve sort of alluded to this, is thinking about, it's like an optimistic view of the region, its potential, its strengths, looking ahead, 10, 15, 20 years and saying like, what do we want this region to look like?
Yeah.
And then once we paint that picture, then it's a matter of like, okay, so who's going to actually build toward that, right? Well, guess what? It's us. Like we're the community leaders, whether we're at SIP or local governments or these institutions or even private business, employers and business leaders. We're all in this together. We all live here. We all love to live here, and we all want to make the best region possible. And so I think these events become like a forum where you can get away from sort of that parochialism, the over emphasis on too much detail and the minutia. And we can actually start to paint that picture of the future and then figure out, okay, so what do we need to do? And sometimes it's solving problems and talking about constraints, but other times it's about pursuing opportunity. What happens if we get the region together and we say, hey, let's pursue a big event or a big, let's track something here. There's all these opportunities as well that we can weave into these conversations over time.
And a good example of that happened in our past, you talk about the blizzard of 96, but also the Commonwealth Games of 94.
Oh, of course.
And I know, yes, that was, now 30 years ago, but the unity that came in this region and the delivery of that was exemplary. And that's just an example of what we can do given the opportunity.
Yes, exactly. And were you both were you heartened to see how much collaboration and conversation there was? It seemed to me there was a lot of robust conversations, a lot of laughing, deep talking, all sorts of things.
The energy in the room was unbelievable because it just was that hum, that buzz.
Yes.
And I think it was people having the opportunity to speak and to share and to think and to be challenged. And it was like, please let me do this.
Yeah. No, it's great. It was so wonderful to meet so many people, and so many of them said, we can't wait to do this again. Next steps. What are the next steps? You both talked about action. What happens to all the insights and ideas you gathered during Local Leadership Day, and how are they going to be shared and applied?
Yeah, well, there's two immediate next steps, and there's probably many that will follow this, but the first one is really to gather back the information and gather like the stuff that was discussed at the day and really mine that for the what was said, the actions, the solutions, the context, these things. From there, we'll take that information to the SIP partners, Municipal Partners Committee, which Steve sits on, and have them sort of digest it a bit. And then we want to circulate that to all the local governments and actually with some call to action, like here's what was said, here's what we're looking for you to do, or at least consider to do. And then the second one would be the Rising Economy Conference, which is March 6th, 7th, and 8th, 2024. And we talked about this already, but basically using that as a platform to sort of invite further input or further action, right? So someone could say, hey, here's a part of the solution that we haven't discussed, and that, they could take that on.
That's great.
Whatever that looks like. Yeah.
That's great.
I think to add to that, and it's important to recognize this is not SIPP delivering something for the region to do. This is a report or a documentation of ideas that came from local leadership, and here it is, coalesced into a report of some format for municipal governments to take action on, not as directed by SIPP, but as directed by the people that were in that room to say, here's what we think. What do you think? Let's get going.
Very good point. Very good point, Steve. And I want to remind everybody that the Rising Economy Conference is coming up March 6th to 8th. Go to ourrisingeconomy.com and register now. You don't have to pay anything yet, but register now so that you're the first to hear about early bird pricing. This is a great conference, an important one for the region coming up in March. So we look forward to seeing you there. That's really all the time we have for today. And I want to thank Councillor Steve Duck from the great township of Sidney and Dallas Gislason from South Island Prosperity Partnership. It's really been a pleasure. And it's great to talk about the region, because when you see it all together and when you're in a room and you hear voices from all parts of the region talking, it's so powerful. And thank you to our listeners. You can tune into Rising Economy podcast on CHEC's podcast network or anywhere you tune into your favorite podcasts, including Spotify. One more reminder, ourrisingeconomy.com. Check it out for the big Rising Economy conference coming up in March. And thank you both. Pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, thanks,
Thank you, Kerry. Carpe diem.
This podcast is brought to you by South Island Prosperity Partnership. Learn more at southislandprosperity.ca.